Hey there YouTube, I'm Yukitsu, this is Yukitsu Times, welcome to my channel, welcome to a little bit of Battlefleet Gothic. So this one is another one being done on request here. As you can see, we're probably going to be playing Nurgle because we've got the name Foxius Bile, and that's basically nicknamed after Fabius Bile, to explain the really crappy joke there. Anyhow, Nergal is an interesting one because, typically speaking, I wouldn't actually recommend you ever make a pure Nurgle fleet. And there's a couple of reasons for that, but you can still do it, and you can still get away with it pretty easily. It's just that it doesn't quite work as well as one that focuses a little bit on synergy with some other elements to the fleet there. So let's go ahead and start adding in some ships there. You can really go with either of these, depending on sort of what strategy you're going to go. But largely speaking, you're going to actually be abandoning these ships pretty early on. The Hellbringers are just a very weak class of ship there. Now, the heavy macro turret is actually quite nice, and the ability to have long-range lance fire, there's nothing particularly wrong with that, but the fact that these ships are over 100 points, for something that's relatively fragile, and just doesn't have that much going for it, really means that you can't do a whole lot with these guys. We are going to pick the Mark 1s here, the carrier variant, just because as you sort of get into the mid portion of the game, they're a little bit more useful. The Hellbringer Mark II just gets outstripped so hard by the Tier 2 ships, and even the Tier 3 ships, that it just really becomes pointless to have these things in your fleets. Now, the one advantage to these guys theoretically is that they have got the 12,000 base range, but since their damage per second per broadside is 2, you're basically going to be there for like an hour if you actually want to kill something. So realistically speaking, this ship is garbage as soon as you get to the higher tiers. Now, it can actually be quite strong in the very, very early game, simply because you're up against other ships that have low hit points. But once you're up against something that's got a lot of hit points, got 200 shields or something like that, you're basically doing 0 damage with these things, so there's just no point in having them. So we're going to go ahead and take the carrier variant. Because at least they can do a little bit of burst damage with these carrier bays. Like, yeah, the damage per second value on the Ordnance Launch Bay is kind of pathetic, but at the same time, it's a lot more damage potential in the sense that these things, like, you sort of outpace the damage that these things do with healing once you get late enough into the game. It's not really that bad, but, you know, I just don't find them too useful. Now, even these guys, though, we aren't going to be using them for forever, but we are going to go ahead and still add in these recon beacons. If you're really daring, you could avoid getting the skills for these types of ships. Like, we're going to try and risk it since we're only going to be able to use 2 of our ships at a time. We're not actually going to add anything to the Hellbringer here. So this will save us 25 points of renown, and if we can get to the point where we need a level up and have 25 left over, then we'll have that sort of going for us. So let's take a look at some other options here. Now, for the very early game, for either of these ships, you do want to have the recon beacon. Since you do want to be able to figure out where your opponent's ships are and be able to launch stuff at them and then start running away from longer distance. Otherwise, you're going to be doing whatever it is you're trying to do for forever, basically. You'll also, typically speaking, want to try and get a couple of volleys off with your macro batteries. The heavy macro turrets actually deal quite a lot of damage, and if you can do a couple of volleys with these things, like each volley here is about 27 damage to shields, assuming that you land all hits, which you won't. So if you can focus fire and get like maybe 4 or 5 volleys off, maybe even 6 volleys off with these things, or sorry, well 3 from both ships combined, you're probably going to take out the shields of your opponent's ship, and then you'll be able to attach a recon beacon directly to one of them. So you can use one ship to spot them and then the other ship to attach one permanently. At that point, that ship's basically going to have bombers heading towards it throughout the rest of the match. So it's a way that you can sort of get vision on your opponent and then deal damage to them consistently over a long period of time. So that is why you do definitely want to have these recon beacons in the early game. Now, later on, we can switch them out once we get other ships that have the ability to take a recon beacon and another ability. Now, there's 2 sort of ways to go about this. We can either take the micro warp jump, or we can take the enhanced induction cells later on. Either of those work quite well. The last one, of course, is the stasis bomb. It's sort of the same thing in the other direction. Rather than making yourself go faster, you can make your enemy go slower. Any of those 3 options are good options for this type of ship, since it'll let them sort of keep away from the enemy fleet a little bit better. So, typically speaking, I'm going to switch mine out personally for the enhanced induction cells later on, or the stasis bomb, depending on how I feel. Really, it's both of them are very, very good for the same purpose. So anyway, let's go ahead and level this fleet up a little bit to the point where we can get it up to being a bit of a Nurgle-y fleet, and I'll show you as well how we level it up once we get there. Until then, of course, you're just going to be playing this as standard Chaos, either Carrier or Lance, depending on what you choose. It'll be the exact same sort of thing as what it would be with a normal standard Chaos fleet. Okay, so we managed to win our first battle there, and now we get to talk a little bit about how to progress with your fleets. Now, this is going to be really up to you for this stage of the game, because, again, you're going to abandon your light cruisers for the most part when you're in the higher levels, but you're going to still need them to be effective, so don't leave them naked or anything like that. That would be a bit silly. But you are going to want to upgrade them, keeping in mind that it's not going to be part of your final composition. They just have to be effective right now. And in any event, the stuff that you would put on a Nurgle ship isn't necessarily stuff that would be bad on a generic Chaos ship in the first place. So one of the first things that we might want to consider, of course, with the Chaos fleets is the emission dissipators, but we could also consider the automated refueling systems. Automated refueling is probably a little bit safer in the early game, so we'll go ahead and grab that. Just because it's more damage per second, it's more reliably going to help us. And of course, for our crew, we're going to go ahead and grab the Warp Talons, because we are going for carriers. That's our only real source of damage or only effective weapons there. So we're going to go ahead and grab that combination on both of these guys here. So this is going to mean that our next upgrade, though, for these guys is probably going to be the emission dissipators, simply because, again, we want our fleets to be able to perform those high maneuvers while at long distance. If someone throws out a probe at us, we want to be able to dodge that no matter what comes our way. So that could potentially mean that we have to use boosts to get out of the range of that. Now, if someone just drops an auger on top of us, or a recon probe rather, then they're going to see us anyway, and there's not a whole lot you can do about that. But being able to sort of then boost into a cloud or something like that, and then being able to boost from that cloud to somewhere else might help quite a bit. You never know what exactly is going to come your way. So being able to boost and stay stealth with carriers is usually quite good. But not necessarily key. That's why I want to get the damage upgrade first, because this really does increase your damage per second by a huge amount when you're using carriers. So other things that we might want to consider are definitely things like efficient plasma thrusters, just to keep our ships farther away if necessary. We don't desperately need things like enhanced battle bridge or advanced cogitator linkages, because you don't need your special orders as badly. Yes, being able to use the reload function on your carriers is an extremely potent ability, but it's really just not as important as it could be on other types of ships. Now, you could actually make it so that you could pelt away with your turrets. They're actually quite effective from even longer range, but by the time you're aiming at people from like 9k range, the accuracy loss, even with this upgrade, is still pretty bad. You could, of course, increase it so that you're firing from 12,000 and you're using the targeting matrix. That combination could let you deal some pretty decent damage with those, but it's still probably not worth it. Belt armor, all around reliable. If you're going for a full stealth build, you could take camo, but again, this isn't actually an all stealth build, because we're going to be using these ships in conjunction with Nergal, so we're probably not going to be using running silently as often as we could be, because if we get caught, we're simply going to have our Nergal ships deal damage to our opponent in close quarters combat if necessary. So it's just not something that I find synergizes too well. So this is one of the few cases where I would say the fact that we're going for Nergal does matter a little bit, because our next tier of ship is going to be the Slaughter. So anyway, generally speaking, though, if you went for the lance-carrying ships, we might want something like the weapon upgrades for lances, taking stuff so that we can actually deal a little bit of critical with Overload Generator can be quite effective there. And then, of course, you would want to make those ships a little bit better at dealing damage up close and personal, because when you're broadsiding, you can't get away from your opponent as easily while still dealing decent damage. So something like the additional Void Shield Generators, or even the Auxiliary Shield Capacitors, would be a little bit better in many cases. The Auxiliary Shield Capacitors would actually probably be the better one, simply because if you're going to get hit a little bit, you just sort of wait till your shields are a little bit low as the enemy approaches, and you boost away from them once they get a little bit too close for comfort, and just keep that boost on there. So again, you also might want the efficient plasma thrusters, but typically speaking, it's going to be a lot harder to keep your ships out of view when you're using the long-range lance shots, so emission dissipator is usually not as important for me with those types of lance ships. So generally speaking, I will say that I do think the carrier variant is better for this. So strictly speaking, I'm going to recommend things like, first off, take the automated refueling systems. Then, depending on how things are going, you probably want to take the emission dissipator. Then you probably want to take efficient plasma thrusters. Then after that, it's really up to you, depending on what you're sort of going for. Advanced cogitator linkages, if you want that reload to work a little bit better for you, being able to have that reload last longer usually lets you use it for a couple loads of your ships or whatever, or your fighters. You could also go ahead and use something like the improved auger array, which is always quite good, but if you're going to be slapping a lot of recon onto your ships, it's not really that necessary. And of course, you know, belt armor in case your opponent tries to disable your engines and catch up to you. That could be quite good. The alternative to using belt armor, of course, is to never get caught in the first place, but it's not realistic to say that you'll never get caught. So getting crit on your engines is something that can very easily happen, and having belt armor can mitigate that a little bit. And there are plenty of games that I lost that I could have won if I had had belt armor on my ships, but I'm stubborn fuck, so I don't usually take it. So that's generally how we're going to look at these ships in this early game. Now, of course, as well, you could also take escort ships in the early games. Just take one carrier and then a bunch of escorts. Chaos Idolator is actually quite powerful, but realistically speaking, you're probably not going to be able to win that many matches just with these guys anyhow, so strictly speaking, I would stick with the Hellbringers. Anyway, I'm going to level this fleet up just a little bit more, and we'll see what we can get to. Alright, and welcome back. So we've managed to get ourselves another victory. We did lose one of our ships, but that's fine. At this point in time, we have got that sort of major decision, though. Should we make our ships Nurgle marked, or should we get a new cruiser tier? Now, if this was Orcs, I would actually almost recommend getting the favor first in certain respects, but you know, it's a little bit harder to decide with someone like Orcs. I ultimately would decide to get the cruiser. For Chaos, it's obvious. Get the cruiser. You're going to want to have that. You don't really need the mark in this early stage, and it's not going to be doing a whole lot for you. Now let's take a look at our ship options here. So the Slaughter is the obvious choice, and it's the one that we're going to take because it is the obvious choice, and because it is just objectively better than the other options that we've got here. So all of them are equal in terms of defensive capabilities, but the Slaughter is actually faster by a fairly large amount, by about 43 points worth of speed. So that extra speed allows you to do a ton of different things with it. It allows you to disengage your entire fleet if you're up against a much slower, heavier fleet, like an Orc battleship, battle cruiser type fleet, which just moves so slowly that it becomes quite easy to kite. But if they have got some tricks, they could catch up to 188 speed ships a little bit more easily than they could catch up to Slaughters. It also has the option of running down and chasing down enemy ships a lot more easily. And of course, it is the best of the brawler types. Taking a look at its weapons here, it has of course got the two macro weapons here for a total of 6 damage per second. Add onto that the twin link battery. The lance damage on this is pretty decent at 2 per side, so 2 on the left, 2 on the right. So pretty decent damage from the lances all around. Not great, but not terrible either. And the macro weapon is where it sort of really shines there. It's got a decent number of attacks on each side for a total of 8 damage per second, which is actually very respectable when you count in the other top turrets there. So if you're just firing at one target on your left side and you don't have to worry about splitting the turret damage to 2 different sides there, you're dealing actually 14 points of damage with your macro weapons plus the extra 2 on the lances, so the amount of damage coming out of this is very, very respectable. By contrast, you're looking at something like the Carnage over here. It's got much heavier macro batteries, but ultimately because it's like kind of got weird damage values there. It's got 32 damage per with a reload time of 5 seconds, giving it 6 damage per second per side, or per turret, for about 12 damage per second, which is a pretty good amount of damage. Added to the fact that it's got these 2 missile pod turrets, that actually seems like fairly respectable damage. But ultimately I find it sort of stymied by the fact that it only has that 188 movement speed, but this is the next closest ship that I would argue in terms of being next to the Slaughter, just because that heavy macro damage is quite good. But the fact that it's long-range macro weapons is a little bit confusing. The Slaughter is more expensive by a little bit, but not by a huge amount, so if you really just don't want to take the Slaughter, though, the Carnage is the one that I would recommend. Next up, you got the Murder. This thing has the same sort of macro weapon, but because it's got the heavy prowl lance instead of the turrets, it's a lot weaker because it can't focus all of its fire in one direction. It sort of would have to have a target on its front and its side for it to be able to use those, and the heavy prowl lance is kind of shit anyway. Only 2 damage per second. It's got 12,000 range, which is quite nice, but other than that, it's just not really worthwhile. If you're going to go for the 2,000 or 12,000 range, 2 damage per second sort of thing, you're probably just going to take a Hellbringer, honestly. And lastly, of course, the Devastation. Now, this would be if I wanted to go for a purely ranged fleet, and this can actually work with Nergal as well. Being able to have an extra carrier in the fleet is never a bad thing, but since this thing's got this sort of macro turret and the lance battery and the missile pod turret, you're looking at about 6 damage per second from macro weaponry and about 2 damage per second per side from the lances. So similar amount of lance damage as the slaughter, and it's of course got the carrier capacity, but again, it's got that problem of having 188 speed. Now the problem with 188 speed on a carrier is that it being easier to capture really doesn't do you any favors, and since it's not any better at carrier capacity than the Hellbringers, if you're going to take a carrier combination fleet, you might as well bring Hellbringers, because the extra money that you're paying for well, all you're really getting out of it is another 200 hull integrity, an extra 100 points of shield, a slower speed, and the lances, which are only doing 2 damage per second. You're pretty much better off in every way taking the Hellbringer instead of the Devastation in many respects. But you can go for the all-carrier fleet with the Devastation. You can do that with Nurgle. The way you would do it is you would take this, you would mark it, and make it so that if the enemy had tried to approach you in any sort of aggressive manner, in any sort of aggressive stance, you simply murder the hell out of them with the sort of mark of Nurgle, in conjunction with the fact that hopefully they're quite depleted by the time they get close to you, and the fact that the Devastation can sort of fight its way out of a wet paper bag a little bit better than the Hellbringer Mark 1 can, because it has got like even the Hellbringer's got decent macro weapon damage. This got the lance on top of it, but more importantly, it's got the extra 200 hull integrity and that extra 100 points of shield. So yeah, if you're stuck in a fight, that can make a pretty okay difference, but ultimately it's still not a very tough ship. Now the Slaughter does run into that problem as well, but you're really hoping that the really good offensive capability of the Slaughter, combined with its maneuverability, allows it to pick its fights, destroy its opponent before it really becomes a big problem, and so on and so forth. So that's sort of how this ship works. So anyway, we're going to go ahead and pick the Slaughter. In this case, it is not just the best Nurgle ship. I would say it's just the best cruiser tier ship under general circumstances, but I can definitely see times where you might want to choose something else. So in this particular case, we can go ahead and get a recon beacon, which is going to be a staple of this tier of ship. We're going to eventually start removing them from the Hellbringers, because not only do we not really need them on the Hellbringers, but we actually need the mobility on these guys. So going to be kind of worth getting rid of those and switching them out for induction cells is what we're going to go with in this particular case. So that could be our option. Now, what we do in this case is just gradually replace these. For now, I think that the recon beacons are still a fantastic choice, so we'll keep going with those. Anyway, we're going to level these fleets up just a little bit more, and we'll see what we can get to. But the general gist of what we're going to try to do here is get ourselves to the point where we can afford to upgrade our first Slaughter with the Mark of Nergal, because it is the ship that is going to benefit most heavily from it. And the way that this fleet is going to work at that point is the Slaughter goes out to the front of the fleet there, makes itself a nice big target in a certain sense there, gets mixed in with the opponent, while our Hellbringer is dealing really good damage and providing fighter cover support and so on and so forth. Now, ideally speaking, we get a lot of chip damage in on the enemy fleet with our Hellbringer, with the carrier capacity, but ultimately this doesn't really work too well in the early stages of the game. There's sort of a counter synergy here with having one ship that's really good at long-range bombardment and one ship that's really good at short-range brawling. And that is that if your opponent has like a carrier and a better brawler than you, because there are better brawlers at the cruiser tier than the Slaughter, then you're going to be in a little bit of a pickle. So especially before the Slaughter gets any upgrades, before this thing gets the armor-piercing macros, it's pretty much not that great at taking out something like, say, a Space Marine strike ship, for example, just because it doesn't have that much armor-piercing damage, doesn't have the torpedoes to let it sort of duel with those guys a little bit more effectively, so you can definitely run into some problems with this guy. Now, of course, we could also go for a more durable approach to this guy instead of a more agile approach like we've taken here. If you're going to do that sort of thing, you would of course go ahead and take the supercharged void shield. In that case, I recommend replacing the enhanced induction cells. The reason that I prefer the enhanced induction cells is because this is the ship class that I use to take on Eldar, and that's because with its high speed, its decent health, and its other attributes there, it's quite capable of running down an Eldar ship if it's got enhanced induction cells and it's got some of the other attributes that I like attaching to it. So getting some broadsides against those guys with this is usually pretty easy to do. So anyway, I will level fleet up just a little bit more, and we'll see how things go from there. Alright, so here we are. We've made it and advanced quite a decent amount. Now, coincidentally, I've gotten here at an interesting point. I don't have any other, like, level 4 ships or anything like that, so I can't actually get a new ability here. We have got a new slot, and all our Hellbringers are alive, so we're in a very peculiar spot here, in that I can easily get our Slaughter upgraded up to Nergal at this point where I just hit level 3. You're typically not going to see this. You're often going to have to be a couple battles in before you can do that, because you'll either have to have bought some skills for this Hellbringer here, or for any other reason whatsoever. So we do have a slight bit of a weird thing going on here in that I can just go ahead and mark of Nergal right now. Now, in this particular case, we've got the option of either marking up 2 of our Hellbringers here, or we could, of course, upgrade the Slaughter with the Mark of Nergal. Now, obviously, we're going to give it to the Slaughter. Now, the way that we're going to have this fleet work in its current configuration at this point in time is if we can bring both Hellbringers, of course, we will bring both Hellbringers plus the Slaughter. But mostly what the Slaughter's job is to do, if we take that composition, is to sort of run interference, essentially. This is a bit of a composition that requires a bit of a formation going for it, but basically this thing is an absolute nightmare if you're ignoring it at close quarters combat, because it is dealing a hell of a lot of damage. You can think of its damage per second per ship as being 3, just for them being around it, and then you're doing quite a lot of damage per side if you can sort of get the enemy ships to sort of stream past it. If you can sort of make it so that the enemy's going past towards your carriers, end up being between these guns, you can spin the ship around just to sort of keep your ship broadside to broadside against a couple enemy ships, and you'll be getting absolutely pummeled the entire time you're doing that, so brace for impact while you're doing that sort of thing. But strictly speaking, this is one of the higher damage per second cruisers out there, so long as you're both using those macro batteries and the lances and the Mark of Nergal all at the same time. Because if you're sort of up against, say, 2 Dauntlesses and you're trading broadside to broadside, you're dealing more damage than each of them combined by a pretty decent chunk. You're doing 6 automatic from the Mark of Nergal, and then you're doing, of course, the 16 from your macros, and then another 4 from the lasers, and then another 6 from your 2 top turrets there. So it's quite a hell of a lot of damage, all in all. Probably going to be able to beat any ship that you're likely to encounter at this level. Now, if you are up against a higher level fleet, as always, I do suggest you have the potential option to run, but you could also try to fight that out. So, our Hellbringers here, basically, we either have 1 or 2 of them. What it's going to do is just keep running away from the enemy. Just going to keep trying to keep away from them. It's going to try and avoid contacting them, and avoid actually having to fight as much as possible. Now, if the opponent turns and fights this ship here, your Slaughter should be able to beat most things in this point of the game unless you're getting rammed. I do find that if you're getting rammed with a Slaughter, you're probably in a little bit of trouble, so you're going to have to focus a lot of your micro on that. At that point in time, just park your Hellbringer off to the side there, have it broadside from 9,000 or something like that, and keep spamming the fighters and the bombers in there and hope that that deals enough damage, while you try and just avoid anything that might hit you with the Slaughter. Now, we have got, of course, the enhanced induction cells, so use that boost liberally once you're in brawling range. It's going to save your ass in a lot of situations. And, of course, if your opponent tries to break away with the ship, chase it down, finish it off, and then turn back and focus on whatever they have left of their fleet. But for the most part, that's sort of going to be your strategy at this point in time. You do also have the option, of course, to have gotten an idolator upgrade, and I actually don't think that's a terrible idea. These things start off really quite strong and become gradually weaker, so the first 2 upgrades can be quite a good idea, and then maybe get the 3rd one later on. I find that the Iconoclast, you typically don't get anything on these guys other than the enhanced auger arrays, just to make it a cheap, throwable, tossable detection ship, but even then I probably don't find that super necessary. So we're going to go ahead and try and get ourselves into a bit of a match here and demonstrate sort of the power of the Slaughter once you get your first one with the Mark of Nergal, and give that a bit of a go. Okay, it took me like 3 hours to get this match, and this isn't even against the proper points value, but yeah, so I don't want to wait long enough to get another one, because I've had a couple platform attack ones, some cargo ones that I just didn't think were really good examples of how to use this fleet, and this isn't a great one either. But in any event, we've got ourselves something that demonstrates the point well enough. So we're going to be using the idolators to represent a long-range attack ship there. So let's go ahead and set these guys to forward fire, 6,000 range. We're going to be using the lock on target. And this guy over here, since he is going to be getting into close quarters combat, will be using something like the brace for impact. Probably going to use boarding action, recon beacon, and repair. So let's go ahead and hit ready. Now, my opponent seems to be hiding in a gas cloud over here, but he could be hiding in debris instead. It's difficult to tell sometimes, but in any event, head on over to the gas cloud first, because that seems more likely. So what exactly is it that we're going to be doing with this fleet? Well, we're going to mostly be using our larger ship of the line as a close-in ship, while these guys try to bombard from the background with their lance-type weapons. So really nothing else to it. You just use your better close range ships at close range, and then use your sort of longer range ships at long range. Now, if I was using a proper composition and this was a 500-point game, I would be using the carriers, and I would have like a couple carriers being guarded by this thing, and we would start the battle by kiting them backwards for several volleys if I could, unless we were up against something like Tau that would have superior fighter capability than I do, in which case obviously that strategy would not particularly work, so just depends on what you're up against, really. Now, my opponent does likely have 2 Dauntlesses and a Firestorm, perhaps, or any other type of escort there. Probably actually the vision-granting one would be the smartest choice, but he is level 1, so you don't know if that's going to be what he ends up taking. So we'll see how that all goes. Anyhow, we can sort of set these guys up sort of back here and just have them fling their missiles from a long distance, and hopefully they'll be okay. They're not missiles, but they're shots. Since they are on forward fire behavior, I don't have to worry too much about how this goes for them. I could just click attack orders on something. Alright, so going to go ahead and try to get rid of these guys' shields here. Now, one of the nice things is that their boarding actions didn't really do all that much to my ship, of course, because we've got ships that are capable of dealing some good damage there. Managed to get a ram in on that guy. That's good. Don't know why I've lost my brace for impact here. Did I lose my bridge or something? Looks like I did. Alright, so taking another weapon hit. Now, thankfully for me, they are taking good amounts of damage because, of course, we're keeping them in range of this Nergal effect here. I'm not really doing exactly any sort of kiting with my small ships here, but let's get this guy away from our small ships.
Moving to those coordinates.
There we go. Prevented the ram at the very least. Still able to get him with our various attacks here. See if we can get him down to the damage state at the very least. Damn. Almost got him. If I had nudged him with the nose of our ship, he would have been heavily damaged. We would have gotten a little bit more experience points. So yeah, that's essentially how you use this fleet. Wasn't the best example. The problem with the idolaters is that they have forward-firing weapons. They can't kite backwards all that well, but a lot of the firepower, you'll notice, did go into this guy, letting the idolaters do a little bit more damage than you generally expect them to do. And they're actually a fairly high damage escort. Not really as much as having another cruiser necessarily, but they're pretty damn decent, in all honesty. So where do we take this fleet from here? Well, honestly, you get probably more of the cruiser tier ships for bruising, getting them medium. Now, you're going to have this sort of awkward period at the phase that I'm at, where this fleet is kind of counter-synergistic. So what do I mean by that? Well, again, the problem with this fleet in particular is that the slaughter here doesn't play nicely with a Hellbringer in a 300-point game or in other low-points games. The reason is that a single carrier or even 2 carriers isn't very useful if they've only got 2 carrier bays. What's typically going to happen is you'll send these guys out in your sort of squad or whatever, and your carrier capacity is just not going to be sufficient to overwhelm the defenses from either turrets or defensive fighter screens from your opponent. Even if they're a low fighter screen sort of a faction like, say, the Imperials, you're probably not going to have enough to breach that defense, meaning that your carriers aren't in enough mass to really kill them. So if I had taken, for example, the carrier cruiser and had taken all carriers, I could potentially punch through with enough carrier volleys and deal a little bit of damage there. The problem is mitigated once we get a second cruiser at level 4, because we'll be able to get a second slaughter there, and that second slaughter means that I can take a double slaughter composition with a few idolaters. And this means that I can sort of tear my way up until I'm out of the cruiser tier and get to the battle cruisers, which is when I can get access to the Styx. The Styx is the turning point, since it's a cruiser, battle cruiser tier ship that has 4 carrier bays. it allows you to have a lot of carrier potential with just that and maybe a slaughter and maybe a couple hellbringers. You suddenly have 8 carrier base, which is enough at even fairly large point games to overwhelm the carrier capacity for a lot of other types of ships that you might be fighting against. And then, of course, once you get 2 sticks, you can drop the hellbringers completely. The points efficiency is a little bit better on the sticks, of course. And then, of course, once you get your battleship, you'll probably want to take your battleship alongside with your slaughters or whatever it is that you happen to be taking. By then, you might want to switch over to the Carnage if you really want to, just because by that point in time, you're looking at a situation where the speed doesn't matter as much. But then again, damage per second on the slaughter is kind of similar in all honesty. The only difference is if you really want to be getting the macro upgrades, you can actually, strictly speaking, get way better macro upgrades if you have the Carnage. So you could get them, for example, to have better accuracy out to 9k, and then you could also increase the range on them up to 12,000. So you could actually make like ridiculously long range, fairly accurate macro ships with the Carnage. And you can do the same with the Slaughter, it's just not as worth it, and you'd only have like the 9,000 range instead of 12,000, but really it's not. Long-range macro weapons are kind of a trap in any sense. But even then, your damage is pretty similar once you factor in armor-piercing ammunition, so you can start switching out Slaughters for Carnages. The only real difference, I would say, is the speed. Definitely prefer the Slaughter for that purpose. But again, the Carnage is also a little bit better at damaging Eldar, it's just the Slaughter is better at catching up to them, which is why I use it, so it's really up to you. So yeah, you're going to have a real bit of growing pains leaving in this sort of territory. Now let's go ahead and show you my actual Chaos Fleet, because it is fairly Nurgle heavy. And the upgrades, I haven't redone the upgrades because it is a fairly old Chaos Fleet, but I do still play it from time to time. It's just that I don't really feel like I need to actually change out the skills, but they're not actually ideal. Let's see here, that would be this one. Okay. See if we can actually load in here, since this is a fairly slow process. But yeah, so let's take a look at what we've got here. We've got ourselves the Despoiler, and the Despoiler is a fantastic carrier ship. It has got a lot of lance weapon damage there. It's got 4 damage per second there. It's got another 6 damage per second from all its lance turrets, or another 3 damage per second rather, from all its lance turrets. So all that combined gives it pretty good long-range firepower. The macro batteries are pretty incidental. I don't really worry about them too much, just because, like, for this class of ship, it's not really that great. But you can have this guy on front-firing behavior and deal quite a decent amount of damage to long-range ships, because it's got 12,000 range in all of these things here, giving it pretty good punching power from those long-distance shots. Has got 12,000 on the macros as well, giving it potential to, if someone tries to do a flanking maneuver, for it to deal some damage out to the sides. Not really, but next up we got the 2 Styxes here. These guys are also marked with Nergal in this case, although generally speaking I don't think they need to be actually marked with Nergal. It's probably not necessary, but for the purpose of talking about Nurgle fleets, this is something I would definitely show. For our Despoiler, I definitely don't feel like Nurgle's that necessary, but again, if you want to go for Nergal, you can go ahead and get Nergal on it. But I do think that this setup is a little bit more interesting, and also you could also go double Tzeentch on the Styxes. Now these guys are only 178 points for 4 carrier capacity, as compared to, say, a Hellbringer here, which is 116 for 2 carrier capacity, so generally speaking, the Styx is the most efficient carrier for points cost. You could upgrade to this guy, but then you're looking at something that doesn't actually have as much carrier capacity for the number of points that you're paying, even when compared to the regular old Hellbringer. It's also a lot easier to catch, so you only do this if you really also want to have that lance firepower and a much more durable ship, because it is a 1,200 hit point ship with 400 shields, so very, very tough cookie there to crack through. So the way that you would typically use this fleet is you would take a couple of Styxes that would be about 350 points or thereabouts, so a pretty hefty amount, but then you can upgrade or add in quite a lot of Slaughters to that composition as well. If you're fighting at 700 points in particular, you'll have plenty of points to play around with some Slaughters, and what's going to happen is that your Styxes stay in the back, of course, and are dealing good damage with those fighters, providing fighter screens. Bombers just deal huge damage when they come in those large waves. And of course, if you're getting the heavy carrier upgrades, your damage per second goes up quite a bit. And of course, if your crew gets fully upgraded on the Warp Talons, they're fairly survivable, and you'll be able to deal tons and tons of damage with these guys. You sort of retreat them backwards towards the Slaughters, and once your enemy looks like they're definitely going to start catching up to your carriers, you intercept with the Slaughters and you start slugging out with them, let your carriers retreat. And One of the interesting things about this particular combination, if it looks like they're going to catch up to your carriers, but you intercept them with your slaughters, if they decide to turn and fight your slaughters instead, you can actually disengage the slaughters because they're very high speed after you've gotten to that fight and your carriers have gotten clear. So once your carriers are safe, you can turn and run away with the slaughters and continue kiting after that. Can be a fairly effective tactics, and this is one of those situations where even though the Styx is a little bit slower, as you can see it's got the 188 speed, you can actually use the Slaughter's increased speed by contrast to an advantage. So I do think that that sort of setup is very, very powerful. Now, why do I like Tzeentch for these guys? Well, it lets me sort of run away from an opponent that's chasing after these guys and reset my stealth. And it would also let me reset the stealth on our slaughters without having to blow too many special orders, allowing me to use more ships on brace for impact or rapid reload or whatever have you. So I just think it's a little bit more efficient that way. So anyway, that's our look at creating a Nurgle fleet. The biggest bump that you're going to have that's going to be a little bit unique is once you get to the cruiser tier, having one slaughter, and then the Hellbringers just really is a bad combination. They don't really play too nicely together, but once you've got your second slaughter, things really open up for you in a big way. So you can always just take, for example, 2 slaughters, and then take some Hellbringers for just purely for fighter cover while your slaughters do all the work. So anyway, hope you found this episode enjoyable, and of course, as always, hope to see you guys all next time.